The transmission that crackled through the Joint Operations Center at Al Frey was not one of panic, but of cold, measured desperation. It was a sound that cut through the sterile hum of servers and the low murmur of analysts, a sound that made colonels spill coffee and generals go still. On the other side of that encrypted line, 60 miles deep in hostile territory, was Colonel Marcus Thorne, Calcine Warden. His special operations team, a ghost unit known as Task Force Nomad, was compromised. The official term was overrun, a clinical word for a bloody, chaotic death. The satellite feed showed their position, a cluster of sun-baked buildings in a forgotten desert village, now swarmed by an overwhelming insurgent force. Red icons, representing enemy armor, were closing in. The situation was deteriorating not by the minute but by the second. Thorne's voice, usually a baritone of calm authority, was strained, clipped. Jaguar-actual, this is Warden. We are Winchester on anti-armor taking effective fire from T-72s, east and west. Immediate air support required. I say again, immediate. The Air Operations Director, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the stress of his command, keyed his mic. Warden, this is Jaguar. Assets are spooling. Nearest fast movers are F-22s out of value date ETA 20 minutes. Can you hold for 20? A burst of heavy machine gun fire answered him, so clear on the comms it was as if the gunner was in the room. Then Thorne's voice, tight as a wire. Jaguar, I don't think you're reading me. We don't have 20 minutes. We don't have 10. The eastern wall is breached. Get me anything that flies. I don't care if it's a crop duster with a bag of grenades. Any jet, any pilot, send them now. The request hung in the air, a flagrant breach of protocol. Any jet was not a term used in the precise, calculated world of modern warfare. It was a cry of pure, unfiltered need. The director scanned his boards. The Raptors were too far. A flight of F-16s was armed for air-to-air, useless against tanks. A B-1 bomber was circling at 30,000 feet, but its ordnance was too indiscriminate for the close-quarters fight Nomad was in. Then, a single, overlooked icon blinked on a secondary airfield screen. It was a Warthog, an A-10 Thunderbolt II, a relic from a bygone era, a plane designed to kill Soviet tanks in a war that never happened. It was slow, ugly, and decidedly not a jet in the sleek supersonic sense of the word. It was on standby for a routine training sortie, armed to the teeth with a full drum of 30mm armor-piercing incendiary rounds and a smattering of Maverick missiles. Its pilot was Captain Kalen Strayanescu. The director hesitated for only a second. Protocol was a luxury. Thorne needed a miracle. This ugly duckling was the only asset that could be overhead in less than 10 minutes. Wharton, Jaguar, we have a single A-10 Calcine stray 7-1. She's 5 minutes out. Can you mark your position? The silence from Thorne's end was different this time. It wasn't the crackle of gunfire. It was the flat, dead air of disbelief. An A-10, a Warthog. They were sending a single, slow-moving gunship from the 1970s against modern main battle tanks. The mockery was unspoken but palpable, a wave of incredulity that flowed back through the speakers. Finally, a different voice from Nomad's position. The team's JTAC, a young airman named Carter. Jaguar, roger that. A-10 on station. Warden is busy. We'll mark friendlies with IR strobes on the northern rooftop. Target is everything else. The transmission ended. In the JOC, all eyes turned to the main screen, to the lonely blue icon of Stray 7-1, lumbering its way toward a sea of red. No one said a word. They were sending a stray dog to a wolf fight. Captain Kalen Ionescu banked the A-10, the twin turbofan engines whining behind her armored cockpit tub. The desert floor stretched out below, a monotonous canvas of beige and brown. Her heads-up display painted it in shades of green and orange, a digital reality overlaid on the analog world. She was Stray, a calcine she'd earned at the academy, not for any maverick tendencies or hotshot flying, but for the opposite. She was a quiet professional, an obsessive student of her aircraft, a pilot who preferred the dense technical manuals of the A-10 to the boisterous camaraderie of the officers' club. She was a stray because she didn't fit the mold of the modern fighter pilot. She hadn't been recruited for her swagger or her Top Gun smile. She'd been recruited for her mind. Her father had been a Romanian mechanic who defected during the Cold War, a man who could coax life from dead engines with nothing but patience and a wrench. He'd taught her that every machine had a soul, a language, and Kalen spoke A-10. She knew every rivet, every hydraulic line, every ghost in its machine. She knew the way the titanium bathtub she sat in would groan under 7Gs. The particular shudder of the airframe just before the GAU-8 Avenger cannon spun to life. The A-10 wasn't a sleek thoroughbred like the F-22. It was a workhorse, a flying tank. Its wings were broad and straight, designed for low-speed maneuverability, not supersonic dashes. Its engines were mounted high on the fuselage, out of the way of ground fire and foreign object debris. It was built to be tough, redundant, and survivable. It was built to fly low, to get hit, and to bring its pilot home. It was, in every way, an extension of her own personality, underestimated, resilient, and brutally effective at its one chosen purpose. Stray 7-1. This is Nomad, JTAC, calcine eyeball. The radio crackled, pulling her from her thoughts. You have us in sight. Kaylin toggled her targeting pod, the camera slewing to the coordinates. The village bloomed in her display, a chaotic scene of muzzle flashes and smoke. She saw the IR strobes, a pathetic little cluster of blinking lights on one of the larger buildings, and around them, the wolves, at least for T-72s, their long barrels menacingly covering the compound. Dozens of Technicals pickup trucks with heavy machine guns bolted to the backs swarmed the streets. Eyeball, Stray has you visual, she responded, her voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos on the ground. I see your dance party. Looks like you're the main attraction. There was a nervous chuckle from the JTAC. Yeah, well, the DJ sucks. Warden wants the tanks gone first. Easternmost T-72 is priority 1. He's about to knock on the front door. Solid copy. Eyeball, Stray is inbound, east to west. Tell your boys to keep their heads down. She rolled the Warthog into a shallow dive. This was the moment the mockery from the JOC would either be justified or silenced forever. An A-10 against a modern tank. The T-72's reactive armor was designed to defeat shaped charges, not the kind of raw kinetic fury she was about to unleash. Her thumb moved to the weapon select switch, resting on the icon for the GAU-8. The Avenger, a 7-barrel Gatling gun the size of a small car, firing 30mm depleted uranium shells at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The A-10 wasn't built around a cockpit, it was built around this gun. As she lined up the shot, she could almost feel the skepticism radiating from the ground. These operators, the elite of the elite, were used to the surgical precision of a 500-pound laser-guided bomb dropped from 20,000 feet. They were used to the whisper of a Hellfire missile from a Reaper drone they never even saw. They were not used to this. This was personal. This was a pilot looking her target in the eye, albeit through a screen, from a few thousand feet up. She squeezed the trigger. The world dissolved into a roar. It wasn't the clean whoosh of a missile launch. It was a deep, guttural bryrat that shook the very air. The entire aircraft vibrated around her, a controlled explosion of violence. For 2 seconds, a stream of incandescent death, like a laser beam forged in hell, connected her aircraft to the desert floor. The shells, each the size of a milk bottle, struck the T-72's turret. They didn't explode. They punched through, the thick steel as if it were wet cardboard, the depleted uranium core vaporizing on impact, superheating the interior of the tank to several thousand degrees. The ammunition inside cooked off, and the turret, a solid 12 tons of metal, blew 50 feet into the air, spinning like a macabre coin toss. On the ground, the men of Task Force Nomad, who had been bracing for the end, stared in stunned silence. The deafening roar of the gun run was followed by the even more deafening boom of the exploding tank. Dust and debris rained down. Carter, the JTAC, fumbled with his mic, his voice cracking. Jaguar, Stray. Good hit, holy. He couldn't finish. Colonel Thorne, crouched behind a crumbling wall, looked up. He saw the A-10 silhouetted against the afternoon sun. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't fast. It looked ancient, angry. It looked like a guardian angel forged from scrap iron and fury. He watched it bank lazily, its wide wings catching the light, as it prepared for another run. And for the first time since the firefight began, Marcus Thorne allowed himself a sliver of something he thought he'd lost: hope. The colonel had demanded any jet. He had gone silent when her A-10 arrived. Now he was a believer. Kaylin pulled up from the gun run, the G-forces pressing her into her seat. Her breathing was steady, her heart rate a practiced calm. One down. She checked her systems, the muscle memory of 1,000 training hours taking over. The GO-8 had 950 rounds left. 4 Maverick missiles were still slung under her wings. The battle was far from over, but the first blow had been struck, and it had been decisive. She had their attention. Eyeball, this is Stray. Target number 2 is the tank on the western approach. I'm coming in from the south this time. Keep me appraised of any ground-to-air threats. Roger, Stray. Carter's voice was stronger now, laced with an awe he couldn't conceal. Sky's clear for now. They're a little confused down here. You really got their attention. That's the idea, Eyeball, she replied, her voice flat, professional. Let's keep them confused. She knew this was the most dangerous phase. The initial shock of her arrival would wear off, replaced by a desperate, focused rage. The enemy would start looking for her, trying to bring her down. The A-10 was tough, but it wasn't invincible. It was vulnerable to anti-aircraft guns, to shoulder-fired missiles. Her job now was to be a ghost, to appear from unexpected angles, deliver a devastating blow, and then vanish back into the desert sky before they could draw a bead on her dot. Father had taught her about the concept of flow, a state of perfect symbiosis between man and machine. He'd find it working on a complex engine, his hands moving with an intuitive grace. Each turn of the wrench, each twist of a wire, part of a seamless dance. For Kaylin, flow was found here, in the crucible of combat. The A-10 was no longer a machine she was piloting, it was a part of her. The flight stick was an extension of her will, the HUD, a window into her mind. She could feel the air moving over the wings, sense the strain on the engines, anticipate the enemy's next move with a clarity that bordered on precognition. This was why she flew the Warthog, in an air force obsessed with speed, stealth, and standoff capability. The A-10 was an anachronism. It was a close-quarters brawler in an age of snipers. But Kaylin understood its soul. Its purpose wasn't to fight other aircraft or outrun missiles. Its purpose was to protect the soldiers on the ground. It was a shield, a hammer, a promise that no matter how bad things got, they were not alone. The name Warthog had been given as an insult by pilots of prettier jets, but the A-10 community had embraced it. It was ugly, it was tough. It grunted and snorted and dug in the mud, and it was fiercely, terrifyingly protective of its own. She selected a Maverick missile. This time, the Western T-72 was partially concealed behind a building, making a gun run difficult. She locked the missile's seeker head onto the tank's heat signature, the distinctive crosshairs on her display glowing a steady green. Eyeball, Maverick, is away, she announced calmly. The missile dropped from its pylon with a sharp hiss, its rocket motor igniting a second later, leaving a trail of white smoke as it streaked towards its target. The T-72 crew never saw it coming. The missile struck the tank's weaker side armor, the shape-charged warhead punching through and turning the interior into a molten hell. A plume of black smoke joined the pillar from the first tank, to grim monuments to the Warthog's fury. In the Jock at Al Dafra, the mood had shifted from tense skepticism to rapt attention. The analysts who had scoffed at the A-10's deployment were now leaning forward, their faces illuminated by the green glow of the satellite feed. They watched the two burning hulks, the scattering technicals, the sudden, dramatic shift in the battle's momentum. The air operations director stood behind his console, arms crossed, a slow, grudging smile spreading across his face. He had rolled the dice on a Stray, and she was changing the entire game. Colonel Thorne watched the second tank die from his perch on the roof. The insurgents' assault had faltered. The relentless pressure on their position had eased, replaced by confusion and fear. Their command and control, likely centered in those tanks, was literally burning. He keyed his mic, his voice now a resonant baritone, the strain gone. Stray 7-1, this is Warden. Your fire is having a significant effect. We have enemy infantry massing in the central marketplace, preparing for a final push. Can you sanitize it? Wharton, this is Stray. Kellen's voice came back, as steady as a surgeon's hand. Consider it sanitized. I'm rolling in. The request was for something the fast movers could never do. Sanitize a marketplace meant hitting the enemy without leveling the surrounding buildings, without causing massive collateral damage that would be a strategic failure, even if it saved the team. It required a pilot who could get low, who could see the whites of the enemy's eyes, who could place ordnance with pinpoint accuracy. It required an A-10. It required a pilot like Stray. She armed her remaining Mavericks and a pod of Hydra rockets. The gun was too indiscriminate for this. This required a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. As she dove, she felt that familiar sense of purpose settle over her. She was a Stray no longer. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, a guardian in the machine, defending the forgotten and the overrun. The sky was her sanctuary, and from it, she would deliver them from the wolves. The marketplace was a hornet's nest. Insurgents were using the narrow alleyways and covered stalls for concealment, regrouping for a coordinated assault on Nomad's compound. From Kellen's perspective, it was a complex three-dimensional puzzle. Friendly forces were in one building, civilians could be hiding in others, and the enemy was woven throughout. A single stray bomb, a miscalculation of a few feet, could be catastrophic. This was the kind of work that gave air-to-ground pilots nightmares. It was also the kind of work the A-10 was born for. She descended to 1,000 feet, a dangerously low altitude that put her within range of every rifle and machine gun in the village. The canopy of her cockpit offered a panoramic, god's-eye view. She could see individual figures darting between buildings, the muzzle flashes of their weapons. The world slowed down, each detail sharp and clear. She wasn't just dropping ordnance on coordinates, she was actively participating in the ground fight. Her eyes and her judgment, as critical as any weapon she carried. "Eyeball, talk to me," she said, her voice calm but demanding. "Where do you need me most?" Carter's voice was a lifeline, guiding her through the chaos. "Stray, we have a heavy machine gun nest set up in the second-story window of the two-story building on the north side of the fountain. It's pinning down half my team." Kalen saw it instantly, the rhythmic flash of the gun, the stream of tracers kicking up dust around Nomad's position. A Maverick was overkill, and rockets would be too inaccurate. This was a job for the gun, but it required a surgeon's touch. A full 2-second burst would obliterate the entire building. She needed just enough to solve the problem. "Copy. Eyeball. I see him. Tell your team to button up. I'm going to whisper in his ear." She lined up the shot, her approach vector carefully calculated to give her a clear line of fire without exposing her to threats from other parts of the village. She put the pipper of her gun sight directly on the window. For a target this small, she wouldn't rely on the computer. This was instinct. This was the art her father had taught her, the feel for the machine. She squeezed the trigger for less than half a second. BRRT. The sound was shockingly brief, a clipped, angry cough. A stream of maybe 20 rounds, a mere fraction of the gun's capability, flew across the marketplace. They didn't hit the building, they flew perfectly through the open window. The machine gun nest simply vanished, the window frame now a blackened, empty hole. The effect on the ground was instantaneous. The suppressive fire on Nomad ceased, and Thorn's operators were able to regain fire superiority on their side. Of the street, Carter's voice came over the radio, breathless. "Jesus, Stray, I don't even know what to say. That was art, just doing my job." "Eyeball," she replied, already scanning for her next target. "Now, about that infantry group you mentioned." She spent the next 15 minutes in a deadly, intricate dance over the village. She used her Hydra rockets to collapse a rooftop where snipers were hiding, the 70mm rockets screaming in to turn their position into splinters and dust. She used another Maverick to take out a technical that was trying to flank the compound, the truck disappearing in a ball of fire, and she used the gun again and again, in short, precise bursts, to eliminate enemy squads that were trying to maneuver through the open. She was no longer just air support. She was a member of the team. She was Nomad's eye in the sky, their guardian angel with a Gatling gun. She anticipated the enemy's moves, called out threats before the ground team could see them, and provided a blanket of suppressive fire that allowed them to move, to consolidate, to fight back. The insurgents who had been on the verge of victory just half an hour ago were now being systematically dismantled. Their armor was gone, their heavy weapons were silenced, and their morale was shattered. They had come prepared to fight soldiers on the ground. They had not come prepared for the righteous, terrifying anger of a WARTHOG. The calcined Stray had been a quiet burden for Kalen. It was a reminder of her otherness, of her inability to fit into the neat polished boxes of the Air Force hierarchy. Her instructors had seen her quiet intensity as aloofness, her deep focus on her aircraft as a lack of social grace. She was the one who stayed behind to study schematics while others went to the bar. She was the one who could explain the exact failure rate of a specific hydraulic pump but couldn't make small talk with a general. She was a stray, a lone wolf in a service that prized the cohesion of the pack. But here, in the fire, the name took on a new meaning. A stray dog is often underestimated. It's seen as a scavenger, a survivor, not a pedigree warrior. But a stray is also fiercely independent. It learns to rely on its own senses, its own cunning. It learns to fight for every scrap, to be tougher and smarter than the pampered pets. And when you give a stray a home, a purpose, a pack to protect, it becomes the most loyal, most ferocious defender you could ever ask for. Task Force Nomad was her pack now. The men on the ground, whose faces she would never see, were her responsibility, and she would protect them with every ounce of skill and courage she possessed. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert. The sky was turning a brilliant bloody orange, a symbolic backdrop for the carnage below. The fighting had died down to sporadic rifle fire. The insurgent attack had been broken. Kaylin made one last slow pass over the village, her eyes scanning for any remaining threats. The burning hulks of the tanks were like funeral pyres, marking the grave of the enemy's ambitions. "Warden, this is Stray," she said, her voice tired but steady. "The area appears secure. I'm seeing multiple enemy forces retreating to the east. How are you holding up?" Colonel Thorne's voice came back, filled with a respect that was so profound it was almost tangible. "Stray, we're battered and bruised, but we're all alive, every single one of us. Thanks to you, you single-handedly turned the tide. I've never seen flying like that, not in 20 years of doing this. Just doing my job." "Sir," she repeated. It was the only response she knew. "No, Captain," Thorne corrected her. "You did more than your job. You wrote a new chapter in the book of close air support. Now, what's your fuel state? Can you stick around and watch over us until the extraction birds get here?" Kaylin checked her gauges. "I've got enough to stay for another 30 minutes. Warden, I'm not going anywhere." "Good to hear, Stray," Thorne said. "Real good to hear." As she began a lazy orbit above the village, a lone sentinel in the twilight, Kaylin Ionescu finally allowed herself a small weary smile. The mockery, the doubt, the years of being the odd one out had all burned away in the fire of the GAU-8. She was a stray, yes, but she had found her purpose. She was the shepherd for the wolves below, the quiet professional who had arrived when all hope was lost. She was the pilot of the ugly, outdated, magnificent beast that had saved the day. The colonel had gone silent when her A-10 arrived. Now her name, her call sign, would be spoken with reverence. The legend of Stray had just begun. The 30 minutes Kaylin promised stretched into 45. The extraction helicopters, a pair of MH-47 Chinooks, were fighting headwinds, their progress agonizingly slow. On the ground, Nomad was setting up a perimeter around the compound, tending to their wounded, and collecting intelligence from the battlefield. The silence was unnerving, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the battle. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind sounded like an approaching enemy. But above them, the steady, reassuring whine of the A-10's engines was a constant comfort. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of Stray. Kaylin used the time to perform her own battle damage assessment. Her sensors indicated a few small arms hits on the fuselage and wings, nothing that compromised the aircraft's integrity. The A-10 was designed to absorb punishment. Its hydraulic flight controls were triple redundant. Its engines were separated, capable of operating independently even if one was heavily damaged. The cockpit was a solid titanium shell. The bathtub, capable of stopping a 23mm cannon shell. She was flying the most survivable combat aircraft ever built. Still, she was a professional. She ran through her checklists, her movements economical and precise, ensuring she hadn't missed anything. "Stray eyeball," Carter's voice crackled, breaking the quiet. "Warden wants to know. He wants to know about your calcium." "And Stray, if you don't mind me asking, ma'am." Kaylin was taken aback. In the tight-knit world of military aviation, calsigns were personal. They were earned, often through some embarrassing mistake or a moment of brilliance. They told a story, but no one had ever asked about hers. They had simply accepted it as a label, a descriptor for the quiet pilot who kept to herself. She hesitated for a moment, circling high. Above the darkening desert, the first stars were beginning to appear, pinpricks of cold light in the deep indigo sky. She thought of her father, his grease-stained hands, his quiet pride. She thought of the long nights she'd spent alone, poring over flight manuals, choosing knowledge over camaraderie. "My first instructor gave it to me," she said, her voice softer than before. "He said I was astray from the old ways. That I flew this plane like it was a part of me, not a tool. He said I didn't belong with the new generation of pilots who fly by wire and trust the computer more than their gut." He meant it as an insult. There was a long pause on the ground. Then Thorne's voice came over the channel, overriding the JTAC. "He was wrong, Captain. He was dead wrong. That old way is why we're alive right now. Your gut is why my men get to go home to their families. From now on, that calcine is a badge of honor, you hear me?" "I hear you, Warden," she whispered, a lump forming in her throat, loud and clear. The arrival of the Chinooks was a welcome sight. The big, tandem-rotor helicopters lumbered in from the west, their landing lights cutting through the darkness. Kalen watched from above as they touched down outside the compound, their rotors kicking up a massive cloud of dust. She saw the small figures of the Nomad operators run towards the waiting ramps, carrying their wounded. The extraction was smooth, professional, and fast. Within minutes, the Chinooks were lifting off their heavy bodies, climbing into the night sky. Stray 7-1, this is Nomad Actual. Thorne's voice came over the radio one last time, the sound of the helicopter rotors thumping in the background. We are away. On behalf of my entire team, thank you. We owe you a debt we can never repay. No debt, Warden, Kalen replied. Fly safe. You too, Stray. You too. The transmission ended. The Chinooks turned west, heading for home. Kalen was alone again, the last friendly aircraft. In a hostile sky, her fuel gauge was blinking red. It was time to go. She banked the A-10 one last time, taking a final look at the village. The fires were dying down, the smoke thinning. It was just another anonymous collection of buildings, in an endless desert, but for her, it would forever be a landmark. It was the place where the Stray had found her pack. The flight back to Al Dhafra was long and quiet. She put the A-10 on autopilot, letting the machine handle the simple task of flying straight and level. She leaned her head back against the seat, the exhaustion finally hitting her. It wasn't just physical, it was a deep soul-wearing, emotional fatigue. She had taken lives today, she had stared into the abyss of combat and had not flinched. But it came at a cost. A piece of her would forever remain in that dusty marketplace, a silent witness to the violence and the valor of the day. When she landed, the ground crew was waiting. As she taxied the Warthog to its hardstand, she saw a figure standing under the floodlights, waiting for her. It was the Air Operations Director, the man who had sent her into the fight. As she shut down the engines and the wine died away, an unusual silence fell over the flight line. The usual chatter and clatter of the ground crews was absent. They just stood there, watching her. She unstrapped herself and climbed down the ladder, her legs shaky. The director walked up to her, his face unreadable. She braced herself for a reprimand, for a lecture on breaking protocol, on the risks she had taken. Captain Ionescu, he said, his voice formal. Sir, she replied, standing at attention. He looked at her, then at the A-10 behind her. Its fuselage pockmarked with bullet holes, its cannon stained with the soot of battle. He looked back at her, and his formal demeanor cracked. A genuine, admiring smile spread across his face. That was the finest damn piece of flying I have ever witnessed in my 30-year career, he said, his voice filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. It was more than respect. It was awe. Colonel Thorne is already on the horn with the general. He's calling it the miracle at Al-Khafji. He says, you're a hero. Kalen shook her head. I'm not a hero, sir. I was just doing my job. Your job, the director mused, is to fly a plane that most of the Air Force considers a museum piece. Your job is to support the grunts on the ground. Today, you didn't just support them, you saved them. You reminded a lot of people, myself included, what this aircraft, and pilots like you, are capable of. You reminded us that sometimes, the old ways are the best ways. He stuck out his hand. Welcome home, Stray. She took his hand, her grip firm. For the first time the calcine didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a name she had earned, a name she had defined on her own terms. The story of what happened in that village would spread. It would be told in hushed tones in briefing rooms and shouted over beers in officers' clubs. It would become a part of the institutional memory, a modern legend. The story of the desperate colonel who asked for any jet and the quiet pilot in the old Warthog who answered the call. The story of the Stray who became a legend. In the weeks that followed, the official reports were filed, the after-action reviews were conducted, and the legend of Stray 7-1 began to solidify. The gun camera footage from Kalen's A-10 was classified, but snippets of it were leaked, spreading like wildfire through the military community. The audio of Colonel Thorne's initial desperate call, followed by his stunned silence, and then his eventual unwavering praise, became the stuff of lore. Pilots of F-35s and F-22s, men and women who had once scoffed at the Warthog, watched the footage with a new, grudging respect. They saw the impossible gun run, the pinpoint accuracy, the raw, unadulterated ferocity of the aircraft in its element. They saw a master at work. Calen, for her part, tried to ignore the newfound attention. She deflected the praise, avoided the backslapping congratulations, and immersed herself back in her work. She spent her days in the simulator, running through emergency procedures, and her nights with the maintenance crews, learning the intricacies of a new targeting pod software update. She was uncomfortable with the label of hero. The men of Task Force Nomad were the heroes. She had just been the tool they needed to survive, but the Air Force had other plans. She was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation read by a 4-star general who flew in specifically for the ceremony. Colonel Thorne was there, his arm in a sling but his eyes bright with gratitude. He stood before the assembled airmen and told them the story from his perspective. He spoke of the certainty of death, of the walls crumbling around them, of the moment he had given up all hope. And then, he said, his voice thick with emotion, we heard a sound. It wasn't the scream of a modern jet. It was something older, angrier. It was the sound of a Gawo 8 Avenger, and it was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. They sent us one pilot, in one old airplane. They sent us astray, and she saved us all. The name stuck, but it was no longer a quiet insult or a personal badge of honor. It became a symbol. To the ground troops, stray became a new call for help, a synonym for impossible rescues, for the cavalry arriving in the nick of time. A-10 pilots across the fleet began to fly with a new swagger, a renewed sense of purpose. They were the strays, the guardians of the grunts, the inheritors of a legacy of close air support that stretched back to the P-47 Thunderbolts of World War II. Kalen eventually rotated back to the United States, assigned as an instructor at the A-10 training school at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. The young pilots who came through her classroom looked at her with a mixture of awe and reverence. She was a living legend, the pilot who had single-handedly taken on a tank column and won. But she didn't teach them war stories, she taught them the machine. She taught them the soul of the warthog. She taught them what her father had taught her, to listen to the engine, to feel the air over the wings, to become one with the aircraft. She taught them that the A-10 was not a weapon of vengeance, but a tool of protection. Its purpose was not to kill, but to shield. It was the last line of defense for the soldier in the ditch, the operator on the rooftop, the Marine pinned down on the beach. It was a promise, written in titanium and depleted uranium, that they were not alone. Years later, when the A-10 was finally, inevitably, slated for retirement, there was a massive outcry, not just from the pilots, but from the Army, from the Marines, from the Special Operations community. They told stories. They showed battle footage. They pointed to the lessons learned in places like Arkavji. They spoke of the unique, irreplaceable capability of a pilot who could get low and slow, who could see the battle with their own eyes, who could deliver precise, devastating firepower in the most complex and dangerous environments. The centerpiece of their argument was always the same, the story of Stray 7-1, the story of the day the modern, networked, standoff military machine had failed, and a single pilot in a 40-year-old airplane had saved the day. The story proved that technology, stealth, and speed were no substitute for courage, skill, and the unbreakable bond between a pilot and the soldiers they protect. Kalen Ianscu never flew in combat again. She finished her career as a colonel, commanding the very training wing where she had once been an instructor. She remained quiet, professional, and unassuming to the end. But her legacy was written in the sky. It was in the roar of the Warthog's engines, in the reverence with which ground troops spoke its name, in the generations of pilots she trained to follow in her footsteps. She was the stray who had reminded the Air Force of its most sacred duty, to protect those on the ground. She was the pilot who had answered the desperate call for any jet, and in doing so had become a legend. Her story was a testament to the idea that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the newest or the fastest, but the one with the most heart, flown by a pilot who understands its soul. The sky was vast and silent, but for those who knew where to look, it was filled with the echoes of her flight, the ghost of a warthog, circling forever, watching over the ones below.